Okay, thank you very much, and thanks also for Andrew and everyone for inviting me to be here. This is really very interesting. I'm from the Asian Development Bank, and we have a couple of, we're sort of moving, even though we're also actually involved in ICPs and all that. One of the projects that we've been working on a lot is multi-regional input-output tables. And for those of us who are economists interested in growth and productivity issues, we found a lot of interesting things in this data that we're trying to do. As some of you may know or not, other than Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and sort of the Baltics, all other countries in the former Soviet Union are members of the ADB. So we've been working quite a bit with some of the countries to produce input-output tables and consolidate it with the social accounting into the rest of the data. And I would have liked to, at this point, present more countries from former Soviet Union the data, but they will not be ready until 2020. This is co-authored with Joseph Mariasingham, who is a senior statistician at ADB, and he's really the expert on input-output issues. So my presentation is on issue of structural transformation. There's a vast literature that has found, a lot of very specific results about how structural transformation works and how it's worked in most countries that are now considered developed. But one thing that has not been done is the importance of linkages and global value chains, which, as you know, have grown very quickly in the last few years. And what does that have to do with development? And within this context, trying to bring in what's so different in formerly transition economies, so the economies of the former Soviet Union. Were actually quite industrialized for a while. There was a very strong links across all the countries. In fact, Leontief, who was sort of the father of all this, of input-output links and central planning, was Russian. And I think that if anything, Soviet Union was sort of had really mastered the sort of application of this sort of planning of production. Of course, then they had a very large fall, and so things didn't quite move. The development of the countries didn't move the way as in other countries. Also, just talk a little bit about how we think about linking goods and services, and how we think about how we can use input-output table analysis to think about economic development. And especially one of the things that we bring to light is the importance of services in development. So this is the motivation of it. There's two or three things that we're trying to do in this paper, maybe a little bit too much. So I'm going to sort of focus on some of the main things. One of them is that the structural transformation literature, as I mentioned, has really yet to dig into the impact of inter-sectorial links in economic development. As you know, the sort of thesis here is that you have sort of a very low productive agricultural sector, and as employment in a country moves from the low productive agriculture to the more high productive manufacturing sector, there's something very special about manufacturing, which allows people to acquire capabilities, the imitation, adaptation, then technical know-how, and then innovation, and then you sort of become an advanced economy after that. And based on trade data, a lot of the tradition has said that there's something very special about the manufacturing sector, and that if you look at especially what are now sort of advanced OECD countries, there was a time during their development in which the share of manufacturing to GDP was very high, the share of employment to GDP was very high. And so this is a sector that is sort of the main development sector. And that then when you move into the services sector, you also move back to a low productivity situation. But this, again, relies a lot on trade data, partly because we have very good comparable trade data, especially trade in goods across countries. So there's a lot of inferences that are being made. And what we think is that there's really an insufficient view. You just have like the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot of things and a lot of links that are happening, especially in the services sectors within a domestic economy, that these analyses don't always capture. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. So what does this have to do with the countries of the former Soviet Union? They are now considered middle income, but as we know, they had a very different transition process. They had, after the breakup, all of the links of the production links were severed across the countries, and they lost a decade of growth, and many really, really had to start from scratch. Perhaps Russia, because it was sort of the economic center of the Soviet Union, did not have quite as many problems, but some of the other countries really had a very steep hill to climb. Now I think they're considered middle-income countries, but we think that there's a lot to learn about that development process, and this idea that everybody has to sort of go from agriculture to manufacturing to services is sort of disputed a little bit more. That's sort of the way it works. Another thing that some literature talks about the middle income trap and about the fact that somehow countries have not been able to progress into high income. And one of the reasons being given for this is this thesis by Danny Roderick, a quite well-known economist, of premature deindustrialization, which talks about the fact that somehow before, for example, countries used to get to 25 to 30% of their employment in manufacturing as a share of total employment, and these countries were developing very quickly. And in fact, that's really the model of East Asia, of East Asian growth. And now what's happening is that this ratio is sort of peaking at much lower levels, maybe 20% of GDP for countries that are currently middle-income countries. And then it falls very quickly, and you sort of move into this, so-called low productivity services. And there's a lot of concern about this. And what we want to say is that this paper sort of trying to say is that it's really not being looked at in a specific ways. First of all, they're considering manufacturing as a closed sector that has these kinds of attributes, whereas in fact other sectors can have these sort of attributes of allowing people to acquire capabilities, especially some specific services. And secondly, this idea that that you have to somehow move to manufacturing, and I say this because for some of you, it may be obvious, but we in the ADB have a lot of countries that come to us and say, policymakers saying, we want to grow faster. We want our share of manufacturing to GDP to reach 28%. What kinds of manufacturing can we develop to get there? So there's still this thought that this is the way that you have to develop. So what we're saying is not, what we talk about here also, although we do talk about growth, it's really not the main thesis. It's really about how you create these capabilities through interlinkages. So we value the spillovers and multipliers of sectors and its ability to reach out and form linkages with other firms, sectors, or countries. So this is a summary. This is a very nice survey by Van Nooy's, fairly recent survey about the literature on structural transformation. And these charts summarize it very nicely. You can see the top talks about employment and value added. The top chart show you that this is for a set of about 8 advanced economies, and the time scale is not actual time chronological, but sort of at the stage of the development, the same stage of development. So you can see that employment in agriculture falls quite quickly at the beginning of development, or at the end of development. For manufacturing industry, mostly manufacturing, you see sort of a hump shape, and which means that, as I mentioned, the share of employment goes up during the main part of development, then it drops. And in services, you have an increase in the service sector as a share of employment, as a share of GDP, and then actually a sort of steepening of the slope, which means that this actually advances as you go up to higher levels of development. And as I mentioned before, this premature deindustrialization hypothesis says that for newer countries that are now at sort of the middle income stage and trying to become more advanced, they seem to move too quickly into services, and that might be a problem. So there's another part of this development literature, which is Hausman and Hidalgo are quite well known for it, which is this idea of talking about export diversification. And countries that are very diversified in terms of exports also tend to be very developed. And this is through this so-called economic complexity index, the idea being that if you are able to produce a lot of different types of sets of goods, and you produce them so well that you can actually export them, and these are goods that are in high demand globally, then you that means that's a revealed comparative advantage. That means that you've developed a certain amount of acquired a certain amounts of capabilities, and also you've been able to diversify, because it means that you've had to not learn to do things just the way that you do them, but you have to learn to work with sectors and other sectors and learn how to do things in other ways. So this is the economic complexity index here. This is a ranking. The first column shows you the rank in 2017 out of 125 countries. For the 3 countries we're interested, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia, actually they're about average. Russia's 27th out of 125. That's pretty good. The others are a little bit below that. But actually, if you compare to Canada and Australia, which are countries that are tend to be compared a lot in terms of their initial conditions or endowments with maybe Russia and Kazakhstan, sort of very large countries with sort of open borders, they very similar. So 24, Canada is 24th, Russia 27th, etc. And another thing that's interesting, I didn't show you all the countries. These are just the former Soviet Union ones, but compared to the rest of the world, their ranking has gone up very, very quickly during the 1995 to 2017 period, probably because they were sort of recovering from the separation of the Soviet Union. There are other 2 indexes that I'll quickly go through that are usually used traditionally to talk about how diversified an economy is. One of them is your export concentration, which is sort of the opposite of diversification. And if you can use a Herfindahl-Hirschel index. I just use the share of HS2 level goods of the top 3 exports as a percent of total. Here, compared to, say, EU, US, and Euro area, some of the countries don't look that great, even though Australia and Canada doesn't look that good either. But, using this very simple indicator, not diversified. Another one is to look at the share of manufacturing and value added. And of course, you have some of the Asian countries having sort of China's off the charts, PRC, China's off the charts. DA is the rest of developing Asia. US is quite a services economy. But again, here it's not too low, but not too high. So not a lot of information about sort of the level of diversification here of these countries. So what we try to do is, what we say, well, the problem is that a lot of, when you're using trade data, which is what's usually used because, as I mentioned, it's the most available one, you don't really understand what is going on within the country. And you need to assume that capabilities embodied in exports actually reflect the capabilities within the domestic economy. Perhaps you're just looking at an enclave. So you can think of a country that has a very strong export processing zone, say for garments, and they're really efficient and they export a lot. But there's nothing going on. Other than garments, you pretty much have nothing going on in the economy. That's not a diversified economy. So you can't really see those sorts of things. Or it may be. Of course, you have the measurement problems. A lot of countries have large informal sectors. Using the country as a unit of analysis, you expect a country like China, for example, to be much more diversified than a country like Bahamas, just by virtue of its size, but we tend to compare 2 very different animals sometimes. And again, what is happening within these sectors, especially the non-tradables, or usually services. Some services are exported, but usually we don't really understand what is happening when we only look at trade data. However, we do sort of subscribe to this idea of Hausman and Hidalgo that, this idea that you acquire capabilities and you sort of move across different sectors is a good way of thinking of development. So there's 3 things that we're going to look at very quickly. I've sort of given you the motivations. I'll jump very much quickly into the results after that. The first is structural transformation. If we try to look more at the domestic economy and the input-output linkages, what can we say about structural transformation? We have a slightly different story to sort of the traditional indicators. How has manufacturing sector changed over time? Now, of course, it would have been really, really nice to have had data on input-output sector before 1990, but of course, we only have data since 2000s. So it's obviously we're looking at very long-term phenomena, but not with all the data we have. But let's see what we do see. And so what we do is we look at the input-output sector using a so-called dot plot matrix, which was developed by Bartolomei and Gorodichenko, trying to sort of detect what are the most important multiplier effects. And we create an index of an agglomeration, which from that basically sort of captures the degree to which an economy can create backward and forward linkages and is participatory across a wide set of sectors. So it's not just creating a lot of, not just one sector creating backward and forward linkages. Then I'll go very quickly, for lack of time, to what that has to do with this usual indicators of comparative advantage. We use the trade and value added indicator of comparative advantage because it sort of shows, it's more representative of how global value chains work. And the third is the role of services in economic diversification. And this is because we found a very interesting phenomenon while we were looking at this data and think that that might be sort of the alternative answer to this deindustrialization hypothesis. And the hypothesis there that as countries move up the income ladder, they should manifest itself in a proliferation of activities related to business and professional services, even though these services themselves are not exported. Oh, 2 minutes, okay, so I'm going to conclude. What I wanted to show you very quickly is, I'll do this right now, is a few so-called dot plot matrices, and let's see, we don't, okay, I'll have to show it to you at the end, but this is the result of the sort of called agglomeration index by sectors. And the first thing to notice is that, and this is color coded by what, and the first thing to notice is that business services for some of the advanced economies, and a little bit for Russia, have the highest agglomeration index. That means that those are the sectors that tend to have clusters around the subsectors and are very well diversified, and as opposed to some of the other sectors. I don't have East Asia, China, and Vietnam, and they tend to have the high-tech manufacturing sectors be very high. The second thing to notice is that in this agglomeration index, actually Russia turns out to do extremely well. So Russia is one of the more diversified economies globally, 4th out of 63 countries, which is all we have in the data. Again, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyz Republic don't do quite as well, but actually they're not too far off the OECD average, and Vietnam, which is considered one of the most diversified economies, according to most indicators. We do look at this, by the way, we look at the correlation of this between income per capita, and there doesn't seem to be any correlation, much correlation, so it's not that. The diversification is not related to that. The second thing that we do is we try to see what this has to do with the growth of the sectors. So some sectors are very immersed in global value chains, have high global value chain participation in certain countries. And if you take those things into account, you can see the first indicator, LMVCAGR, is basically a growth in the value added of country sector. And actually, the higher that is, the higher the trade and value added revealed comparative advantage. So what we try to say is that this is what has to do with growth, which doesn't necessarily have to do anything with economic diversification. And then the third thing is to look at the role of services. And this is where we try to think about structural transformation in a slightly different way. As you all know, with automation and everything, you've had this sort of servitization process of manufacturing, whereas at first you actually start using in-house services, and then eventually you actually start to separate from the services start to be done, should we say, to splinter from the manufacturing process. And most of the services, for example, research and development, engineering services, quality services, are actually done outside of manufacturing. So what we found in our results actually is that this one of the sectors, Sector 30, which is business and professional services and leasing of machinery and equipment, actually have the strongest relationship with GDP per capita. And so if you think of the services that the value-added contribution of this sector to total manufacturing, not just in your country but in other countries, it actually is very highly correlated with GDP per capita, especially the indirect contribution. I'm not going to have time to really go into this, unfortunately. We actually also try to control for country fixed effects and year fixed effects, and still have a very strong correlation between the servitization of manufacturing, in other words, the value-added contribution of business and professional services. And there's some other literature that has begun to see this in some countries, such as the US. I'm going to abuse in the time a little bit, but I just wanted to show you the dot plot matrices, what they look like for Russia and for some of, this is a dot plot matrix for an average OECD economy. And we've computed these for all countries, for all years, for all sectors, everything. And I just wanted to show you very quickly, one thing you see in advanced economies that is always there, that you don't see when they're not advanced. And it's the sector 30, which has this very strong forward linkages across all sectors. And this clustering of business services, these are sector 24 to 30 are, real estate, also it's financial intermediation, post and telecommunications are all services that are usually high-tech services. And you can see that this clustering that occurs is very typical of advanced economies, and you don't see it for other countries. So I'll show you Russia, which is, we can see, for example, this is meant to move quickly, but this is the United States, which is very, China has a lot of activity going on, or Russia. So Russia, actually, you can see that it's actually quite, lots of dots, so it means it's quite well diversified. But less so for the other countries, the sector 30, there's not much activity going on, even though some of the other aspects look like more like advanced economies. So, okay, so yeah, yeah, sorry. So I'm done. I just wanted to get to that before.
Excuse me, we unfortunately have started a little bit later, but sure. Nevertheless, thank you very much. I hope, first we'll, I present microphone to the discussant, Dmitry Piantkovsky, High School of Economics. You're welcome. Please take place here. Вот там пульт, если нужно, возьмите. Все равно.
Okay. Thanks for an interesting paper. I'd like to emphasize 4 points which are most interesting for me. First, it's a modern approach to diversity, post-industrial diversity measured by input-output tables as well as national accounting data. Second one, a comparison of a number of FSU countries. It is very nice, again, from a diversity viewpoint. And new result where the FSU countries are compared to other worlds and ranking from one to another. Probably the most interesting for this time is introducing new data, including non-published input-output tables from RIOT. It's mentioned tables for even 18 years and used 17 years tables for comparison. And the fourth one, and probably the most important, in introducing new diversity index. Let me give a few mathematical formulas about it. This new index, AGG, depends on technical coefficients matrix as well as indirect technical coefficients from the Leontief inverse matrix. This is standard for input-output analysis, but this new and interesting index, it's remind an old index by Wagner and Deller, where as well there are two summands or two multiples. One of them measures the density of inter-industrial linkage. that is the density of the technical coefficients matrix, and the second summand depends on the, so to say, the length of the linkage change, that is the degree of inter-industry linkage. It's measured by the Leontief inverse matrix, both from standard input-output data. This is new and more interesting than, for example, that classical index by Wagner and Deller, because these new measures are, of course, more economical meaning than the standard conditional number of the matrix. But, of course, there are some restrictions based, because this index needs very precise data. In particular, if you would like to compare the diversity for different years, for example, in Russia, we need input-out tables for different years, and there are graphs in the paper for 11 and for the year 2011 and 2017, but of course all these tables are based on the same official input-output tables from Russia from the 2011, and if we see some difference from year to year, that this is mostly mathematical phenomenon than the measure of the diversity or diversification of the Russian economy. But overall, it's an important index, and it use more information than other indexes. So it is a very nice paper, I think. Thanks.
It's all?
Yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much. Do you want to give a response for the remarks of the discussant?
No, not really. Just thank you very much. Actually, that was very useful. You're right, of course, that we don't have all the years. We have some years in the future, but the problem of getting the data across many years has to be interpolated different ways. So.
Thank you very much for your very interesting and detailed presentation. As far as we are a little bit late and the coffee break has already started, my proposal is just to ask questions personally at this coffee break, if somebody would like to. Anyway, we have email addresses and other linkages to, if somebody will be interested in more detailed answers. You won't mind to answer by email if somebody will ask you a question? Thank you very much. The session is closed. Now, coffee break up till 10:15.